You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 357, recorded on March 9th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, as always, from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week on the bonus episode, we're talking about another industrial monopoly from the later part of the Second Industrial Revolution, Carrier. Last week on the bonus episode, we talked about dropped ceilings in offices, and we promised to talk about central air conditioning on a future episode, which brought me and Rachel here today. On a recent bonus episode, Nate and I discussed the history of the natural ice trade, which was eventually replaced by a combination of artificial ice and artificial refrigeration. What we didn't discuss was the other offshoot of artificial cooling processes, which was early air conditioning, and that's the subject of this week's bonus episode. Now, we alluded in passing on that episode to chemical refrigeration originating in Australia as part of an effort to break the American economic dominance of the ice trade, but I didn't talk about how the inventor James Harrison arrived at the idea, which involves chemistry in the printing industry and basic principles of evaporative cooling that we as humans naturally experience ourselves when we sweat, and the evaporating moisture takes the heat away with it. The principle had been demonstrated since the mid-1700s, a century earlier, but not much practical had been attempted with it. Harrison was a newspaper publisher, and at least according to his mythology, his cleaning solution for the type left it cold to the touch after it evaporated, which gave him the idea of using a chemical vapor for artificial cooling in the 1850s. Some sources argue that he merely studied undeveloped American designs, but he developed this along with other innovators into the technology for refrigerators that didn't require ice. That's basically still the premise of how refrigeration works today. Half a century later, the printing industry would once again be the source of a major leap forward in artificial cooling technology, this time for conditioning the air of entire rooms by means of controlling the humidity level. Whereas Harrison in the mid-19th century was accidentally cooling his printing equipment and developed the refrigeration industry, air conditioning as an industry arose in July 1902 as an accidental side effect of trying deliberately to cool down and, more importantly, dehumidify printing equipment, basically to protect the paper and the inks and make sure the machines ran as expected.
To quote from a June 2019 article on the Smithsonian Magazine website, at the turn of the 20th century, humidity threatened the reputation of Brooklyn's Sackett-Wilhelms lithographic and publishing company's high-quality color printing. After 2 summers of extreme heat disrupted business and caused swelling pages and blurry prints, the printing company found that a nascent cooling industry could offer help. Willis Carrier, a 25-year-old experimental engineer, who at the time was working at Buffalo Forge Company, which was hired to solve the publishing company's problem, created a primitive cooling system to reduce humidity around the printer. He used an industrial fan to blow air over steam coils filled with cold water. The excess humidity in the air would then condense on the coils and produce cooled air.
That Smithsonian article and a source that it linked to also note that Florida Dr. John Gorey had also attempted to develop vapor compression air conditioning technology in the mid-19th century to benefit his convalescing yellow fever patients, but he was blocked in this effort by the New England and New York natural ice trade industry that we discussed in depth on our previous episode about that. They are suspected of having pressured potential investors on the Gulf Coast not to capitalize his project after he patented it, published it, and built a prototype in Ohio. Gorey's defenders believe that James Harrison took the design to develop his Australian artificial cooling machines in a country with a vested trade incentive in destroying the American ice exporters' stranglehold. It's noteworthy to me that Willis Carrier's 1902 air conditioning technology was allowed to emerge because artificial ice and chemical refrigerants had already broken the total control of the natural ice industry in the United States. Carrier kept working on improving his designs and built a base of support with industrial enterprise customers who needed to control the temperature and humidity to keep their machinery working properly. Workers and employees might have enjoyed the more comfortable working environments of these air-conditioned spaces, but their comfort was still not the primary focus. People-oriented air conditioning, which is known as comfort air conditioning as opposed to process air conditioning for industrial processes, did not become a thing until movie theaters started opening in the 1920s with air conditioning as a special draw.
In 1945, Life magazine published a 4-page spread about air conditioning entitled Air Conditioning. After the war, it will be cheap enough to put in private homes. The technology was described as a pre-war luxury that was being manufactured in large quantities and sold at a moderate cost in the post-war mass market. So post-war air conditioning probably helped the Sun Belt migration that happened during the post-war boom. The Smithsonian piece doesn't really mention this, though.
Something that we will circle back to as we continue the narrative here.
Yeah. The technology that was initially envisioned as a tool to enhance industrial productivity is now a near necessity for American homes and transportation. Though humans in hot climates around the world have cooled themselves with fans, fountains, and natural ventilation systems for centuries, only the U.S. consumes energy for air conditioning to the extent it does, more than the rest of the nations in the world combined. In 2016, the United States used about 616 terawatt hours of electricity for air conditioning, while the European Union, with a population 1.5 times larger, used just 152 terawatt hours for the same purpose.
That, again, is a quote from the Smithsonian Magazine website article. And as always, we will have all of our notes up when the episode goes up at patreon.com/Arsenal for Democracy. Now, the level of energy usage that Rachel just quoted from that article, even after we at least got less ozone-damaging chemicals for air conditioners, which is a topic for another time, is obviously bad for climate change, but it's probably not going anywhere either. That's a troubling thing, but it's also outside of the scope of our episode today on early air conditioning, so I'm just going to glide past that after acknowledging it, that it's a problem and that it's going to need some sort of a solution. So, Rachel, could you explain a little bit more about the science that Carrier came up with, Willis Carrier himself and the people working with him, in order to develop this technology for early industrial process air conditioning?
Yeah. So a liquid refrigerant is used to absorb heat and then eject the heat to air or water outside of the cooled area. So this is the vapor compression refrigeration cycle. Carrier kind of had a more primitive system, but over the years it got more and more sophisticated to the systems we have today. So the refrigerant enters a compressor where it is pressurized or vaporized. And when it is pressurized, it reaches really high pressure and thus a really high temperature. So at that point, it's absorbing heat. It's then sent to a condenser where cooled air or water is sent over a coil or tubes, something with a high surface area, and the vapor is then returned to a liquid state. The refrigerant ejects the heat and it is sent away by the air or water. So those big units that you see outside of buildings, that's where the heat is escaping. The condensed liquid then enters an expansion valve where it quickly drops in pressure, becoming a vapor-liquid mix. And this drop in pressure also cools it to sub-ambient temperatures. This vapor-liquid mix is then sent to an evaporator where a fan circulates air over this vapor-liquid mix. So the warmer air from the fan evaporates the liquid part of the refrigerant, and cooler air is circulated to the room. And so all that's left is the vapor part of the refrigerant. It's then sent back to the compressor, which starts the cycle over. And over the years, there have been many different refrigerants used. I'm sure we've all heard of Freon, which is one of those not great chemical refrigerants. But they have gotten more sophisticated over the years, and they are designed to be less damaging to the environment.
So Willis Carrier spent the first decade of the 1900s researching, experimenting, and theorizing on the physics and mechanics of air conditioning. He also emphasized air filtration, not just cooling, and I guess air filtration is made easier by using water to filter out a lot of particulates in the air. There was a lot of this source, by the way, that we use for the rest of the episode is going to come from the official corporate history, which we'll be getting into the corporate history itself in just a moment. But Rachel, if you could talk a little bit about some of the scientific efforts that Willis Carrier himself made before forming the company.
Yeah. In 1911, Carrier's research and development efforts came together in the single most famous and enduring document ever prepared on air conditioning. His rational psychrometric formulae, called the Magna Carta of Psychrometrics, was presented on December 8, 1911, at the annual meeting of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, or ASME. The chief's invitation to his employees called him the chief affectionately, and it just kind of stuck. The chief's invitation to this meeting recognized air conditioning as a legitimate branch of engineering and Willis Carrier as its leader. His psychrometric chart, used to correlate temperature and humidity in the design of air conditioning systems, would be reproduced in college textbooks and translated into many languages. It is the predecessor of the charts used today. At the age of 35, Willis Carrier had become internationally recognized.
As early as 1906, Willis Carrier was promoting a dizzying array of potential uses for air conditioning, most of which came to pass within a few decades. By 1907, his designs were already popular enough in the silk industry in the U.S. to enter the Japanese market, which would remain a long-standing connection for Carrier. By 1909, Buffalo Forge Company had separated out but still owned a Carrier subsidiary. And there were some examples of Carrier's early work before they left Buffalo Forge.
Carrier immediately landed an important contract with the Celluloid Company, a firm making film for the new motion picture industry. As business in the textile industry expanded, the company also won contracts to install air conditioning to reduce rust on razor blades at the Gillette Safety Razor Company, in factories producing rubber, rayon, flour, and baked goods, and in a Pittsburgh hospital ward for premature babies. In 1913, a system was sold to an American Tobacco Company facility in Richmond, Virginia. "I never saw such a dusty atmosphere," the chief recalled. Going to work on the problem, he devised the first pan outlet to distribute air gently from the ceiling. The results were wonderful, Carrier reported, and employees from other parts of the plant began eating lunch in the cool, clean air.
So as you can see there, this demonstrates a lot of the different early things that Carrier was able to do with air conditioning. But again, the focus was not on comfort air conditioning for people. There were a few other companies that were providing sort of very boutique comfort air conditioning for ultra-rich customers, all of the guys who owned the giant industrial companies that we've been talking about on other episodes wanted to have air conditioning at their super mansions, and so that did exist. But for the most part, in this phase, we are talking about industrial air conditioning, where the primary objective is to keep the ingredients dehumidified and working smoothly, and to keep the machinery working smoothly, and so forth. Now, in 1915, Willis Carrier and a handful of engineers from Buffalo Forge Company left to launch an air conditioning focused company after the parent company decided to shut down the subsidiary and narrow its operations. World War I provided new opportunities to air-condition defense industry production, basically anything involving manufacturing of firearms and ammunition. A lot of that needed to have very controlled circumstances to promote safety and make sure that everything worked right, and didn't slow down production at all. Similarly, later on in the interwar years, the Navy solicited onboard air conditioning for its ships from Carrier, and eventually in the early 1940s, the Pentagon was built with Carrier air conditioning right from the beginning. We discussed earlier Carrier's focus on first industrial air conditioning and then commercial consumer-facing air conditioning in the 1920s, which was one of his goals from the beginning. In addition to movie theaters, Carrier began air conditioning department stores to keep crowded shoppers from fainting. Later, they would do the same for convention center crowds. And I think that's sort of an interesting point as well. I mean, obviously, yes, the mid-1920s saw Carrier begin air conditioning office buildings in Sunbelt cities in California and Texas. As we talked about earlier, that helped develop the Sunbelt areas for better or worse in the United States. But there were just a general problem, movie theaters, department stores, etc., that these were very sweaty, humid places that caused people to pass out and so forth. There were a lot of these type of environments of indoor spaces, and you needed to be able to figure out not just how to make it a comfortable room once they started doing the consumer-facing air conditioning for the room itself to be comfortable, but also to be able to adjust that variably based on the number of people coming in and out. There were also experiments that they did with how to air condition rail cars and calculate, okay, when you have this many passengers and this type of temperature outside, etc., what do you need the humidity to be to keep people comfortable and also not passing out? And that's sort of a different version of life than many of us are used to in a country like the United States, where there's a lot of humidity. Obviously, not all of the United States has humidity, but that's certainly something that was a challenge for a lot of places. In 1930, under pressure from the Great Depression, Carrier Engineering Corporation merged with two other companies in the heating, ventilation, and cooling industry to form Carrier Corporation, which Willis Carrier was still the head of. The merger also helped the company provide a year-round air service to customers, particularly winter heating, rather than just cooling and dehumidification. And the new company adopted a dealership model for some of its sales. We're going to circle back to the importance of that in a bit. Hospitals and hotels also became a major customer for air conditioning and especially air filtration. Carrier became a major force in upstate New York, especially around Syracuse, after 1937 when they moved their operations there and centralized them rather than basing everything out of multiple cities in Chicago and the northeastern United States. Carrier would end up largely monopolizing the air conditioning market with only a couple minor early competitors, but surprisingly, this was achieved more through tight control of technical knowledge and custom production of tailored air conditioning in the first half of the 20th century, rather than emphasizing mass production manufacturing, although obviously that would change when mass market home air conditioning became a bigger thing. At that point, competitor appliance manufacturers like General Electric and Frigidaire under General Motors entered the AC market. And this is one of the few areas of this where I'm actually drawing from an outside source, although they used research from the archives at the Carrier company. This is from a July 1994 paper published in Technology and Culture by Gail Cooper called Custom Design, Engineering Guarantees, and Unpatentable Data, the Air Conditioning Industry 1902 to 1935, which really demonstrates the centrality of Carrier, both as a person and as a company, in the industry in that time period before World War II. Again, we're talking about that specific period, 1902, into the Great Depression and so forth. And it wasn't a total monopoly. There was more than one company, but it was a pretty close to being a monopoly. And a lot of that had to do with the approach to how Carrier did things and the sort of way that it was knowledge-oriented rather than some of the other similar industrial concerns of the time period that we've talked about on other episodes. The constituent parts of industrial air conditioning systems were often still manufactured in mass production, but how they were assembled was customized to the specific client. And the sales team could basically pitch a concept to a client, and then the engineers would work backward to figure out how to make that feasible. This custom design approach was often necessary not just to fit in with existing architecture of a building, but because the processes happening within a building and the number of people within a space generated unique heat and humidity signatures that needed to be reviewed on site in order to build a viable system. Basically, again, if you tried to design a system for a factory or some other building sight unseen, and you didn't take into account all the variables of how things could change over the course of a workday or over the course of the year, then you would not have a working system. And the Carrier approach was to say, we're not only going to custom design this system, but it's going to maintain humidity within certain ranges for the entire space for the entire year. And they had to be able to be very precise about how that worked. Now, that approach was more expensive for clients, but Carrier's engineers in the early years could always provide vastly more reliable systems through customization than competitors, which could end up saving enormous sums of money for factory owners by protecting their machinery and their goods from unstable humidity levels. The knowledge-driven approach of Carrier ended up being as valuable as the actual patents, which is why the article title includes the phrase unpatentable data. And so we have this combination of a knowledge-driven company that's monopolizing the space, as well as this sort of sales-oriented approach that led them to go with the dealership approach, at least in part, over time. As noted before, air conditioning's true rise to dominance in the United States was in the post-war boom after the hardships of the Great Depression and World War II, although the company had been expanding internationally during that time as well. By 1940, Willis Carrier himself was speculating that air conditioning was likely to become a public utility rather than a privately provided service, and although this did happen in a few cases, it rarely happened, broadly speaking. Now, Willis Carrier himself passed away in 1950, which marks a major turning point for the company and the industry as a whole. But the company that he founded in 1915, of course, endures today as Carrier Global Corporation, although it has recently shifted from being based in upstate New York to being based in Florida. And for several decades until last year in 2020, it was a subsidiary of defense contractor United Technologies, but it was spun off as its own company. You might also remember the early Trump administration brouhaha about whether or not Carrier would agree to keep jobs in Indiana or move them to Mexico. And the United Technologies takeover, by the way, was apparently a hostile takeover. I think I'll mention it in passing again later in the notes. But there was one other thing that I thought was important to emphasize from the corporate history, which is this relationship to the defense industry. Like I said, ultimately taken over by a defense contractor, United Technologies, but a very long-standing connection to the defense industry. And I will turn to Rachel for that.
While conversion to World War II war production meant radical changes for many manufacturers, Carrier's standard equipment, including central air conditioning for productivity and refrigeration for food preservation, required little modification. The military also took advantage of the company's exceptional engineering talent, which set about producing classified equipment like airplane engine mounts, sight hoods for guns, tank adapters, and the Hedgehog, a highly successful anti-submarine bomb discharger. Ironically, war production also benefited from the work Carrier engineers had done in the 1920s and 30s to bring comfort air to department stores. Tiffany & Co., Macy's, Lord & Taylor, and Gimbel's in New York all sacrificed their air conditioning installations to the war, as did Sears, Roebuck & Company in Washington, D.C., Marshall Fields in Chicago, and J.L. Hudson in Detroit. Nearly 7,000 tons of air conditioning was removed from Comfort Air installations and reinstalled to support production by companies like B.F. Goodrich in Texas and Pratt & Whitney in Kansas City, which would become sister companies to Carrier decades later under United Technologies.
So, very important to understand that relationship between the defense industry early on in World War I, then in the interwar years, then in the Pentagon before World War II, and then during World War II. And that brings us to another important question here. Why wasn't Carrier subject to the same kind of antitrust action as the other industrial monopolies, if indeed it was as significant a force and dominating a force, especially under Willis Carrier personally, in the first half of the 20th century? Now, I'm not sure on the answer to that question, but I have some guesses that seem reasonable to me after researching this topic. Timing seems to be a key factor, since it did not form until near the end of the Taft trust-busting years, basically at first as a subsidiary and then as an independent company during the Woodrow Wilson administration. And so it missed some of the trust-busting stuff that hit a bunch of the other corporations that we've talked about on the show. But also, I think this point about how closely it was tied to the defense sector almost immediately from the beginning due to World War I, and then after World War II, there was a more competitive market. I think those things shielded it, right? So during the wars, during the interwar years, there was a lot of reluctance to pressure this company that was seen as vital to defense production, especially making sure that you had smooth and continuous production of guns and ammunition in World War I, operation of naval ships, operation of the Pentagon, operation of airplane and tank factories and things like that. And then after World War II, especially starting in the 1950s, once Willis Carrier had passed away and you had this growing suburban home air conditioning market where you had companies like General Electric and General Motors getting in on that action, then it was a more competitive market, so there wouldn't be as much pressure again to deal with the potential trust question. There were apparently some trust concerns in the later era of trust busting. That would have been around the same time as things like the Ma Bell breakup. But that was more related to the United Technologies acquisition, the hostile takeover by United Technologies, rather than to Carrier alone being dominant in the air conditioning industry alone. Now, I had a few other miscellaneous historical points before we wrap this up, because it's important to understand that while Carrier was hugely important in inventing and developing this industry, first for industrial processes and then for comfort air conditioning, he was not the only figure involved in the air conditioning space, and there were some other people that I figured Rachel could talk about.
Yeah. In 1906, Stuart W. Kramer of Charlotte was exploring ways to add moisture to the air in his textile mill, kind of the exact opposite of Carrier. Kramer coined the term air conditioning, using it in a patent claim he filed that year as analogous to water conditioning, which was then a well-known process for making textiles easier to process. He combined moisture with ventilation to condition and change the air in factories, controlling the humidity so necessary in textile plants. Later, Willis Carrier adopted the term and incorporated it into the name of his company. This was also mentioned in that 1994 paper that Bill referenced earlier. Shortly thereafter, the first private home to have air conditioning was built in Minneapolis in 1914, owned by Charles Gates. Realizing that air conditioning would one day be a standard feature of private homes, particularly in regions with warmer climate, David St. Pierre de Bose, who lived from 1898 to 1994, designed a network of ductwork and vents for his home in Meadowmont, all disguised behind intricate and attractive Georgian-style open moldings. This building is believed to be one of the first private homes in the United States equipped for central air conditioning. And in 1945, Robert Sherman of Lynn, Massachusetts, invented a portable in-window air conditioner that cooled, heated, humidified, dehumidified, and filtered the air.
And just to clarify, those three, that's just pulled from the Wikipedia article for air conditioning, since they were not the central focus of our points today. But three other important figures to the industry. And I found it interesting, the point about David St. Pierre du Bose and his network of ductwork and vents and disguising them behind various Georgian moldings and things like that. That reminded me a lot of the discussion we had on our most recent bonus episode about dropped ceilings and kind of false ceilings and how to hide certain things like ductwork. And so this was a fancy schmancy way of doing that, and that sort of precedes the era of the dropped ceilings from 1919 onward. This article indicates first private home to have air conditioning being around 1914. I read some stuff that indicated that there were earlier ones, but again, it would have been those like super duper mansions for your Rockefeller families and that kind of caliber of family. And I don't know if you would classify those as private homes in the sense that people would be thinking of. So I think when we're talking about private homes here, we're talking about like, say, upper middle class rich person's normal sized home, as opposed to giant super mansions and castles of oligarch billionaires.
I think it's interesting that it got its start as a dehumidification process. So I live in the Mountain West. It's extremely dry, but it does get really hot in the summers. So that's kind of a secondary aspect to me that I didn't even really think about, just because it's a dry heat, as they say, in the summers. So that's not something that I really thought about in that aspect of air conditioning.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny how the Sun Belt is portrayed as being sort of one continuous region from, let's say Florida to Los Angeles, when there's obviously clearly a huge, huge difference between, say, the Florida Gulf Coast, New Orleans, that type of an area, even the Gulf Coast of Texas, and say West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. That's a totally different environment to be dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our topic on this bonus episode on early air conditioning, a fascinating one that I didn't really know a whole lot about, and kind of interesting to see that this sort of recognizable name brand we have today that was still making waves, as recently as 2017 in the news. Carrier descends all the way from the original air conditioner made by Willis Carrier in 1902, and then we can chart the rise to prominence for a while as sort of the monopoly air conditioning service, first for industrial processes and then for comfort air conditioning for people. Rachel, thank you so much for being on this week.
Thanks. This was a fun topic to discuss.